Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. Close your eyes and let the world fade into the whispers of stone and shadow. Beneath the towering peaks of the misty mountains, where the roots of the world run deep, there once lay a kingdom of unparalleled grandeur. Carved into the heart of the earth, its halls stretched vast and endless, upheld by pillars shaped like trees, their trunks chiseled with runes of ancient glory. Rivers ran through tunnels of living rock, their murmurs echoing in harmony with the hammers of the dwarves who dwelt there. This was Khazad-dûm, the greatest of dwarven realms, a city not spread across the land, but woven into the very bones of the mountain itself. It was a place of craft and song, where the fires of the forge never dimmed, where the voices of Durin's folk rang through the depths, filling the air with tales of old and the steady rhythm of labor. Durin the Deathless, the first of his kind, was its father. Born from stone in the elder days when the world was still young, he walked the lands before the rise of the sun and moon, before the first songs of the elves graced the wind. He wandered until, in the still waters of a hidden lake, he beheld his own reflection, a crown of stars shining upon his brow. In that moment, he knew he had found the home of his people. Beneath the unyielding heights of the misty mountains, they carved their halls, shaping wonders unseen by any other race. The dwarves were a patient folk, masters of stone and metal, whose hands could bring forth beauty from the heart of the world itself. And in time, they found something beyond beauty. They found mithril, lighter than a feather, yet stronger than the finest steel. This silver-hued metal became the lifeblood of Khazad-dûm. The elves marveled at it, men coveted it, but only the dwarves understood its true worth. They wove it into mail that no blade could pierce, into circlets that shimmered like starlight, into relics that would outlast the ages. With each strike of their hammers, their wealth grew, their halls expanded, their renown spread across Middle-earth. For long years, peace endured beneath the mountain. The dwarves traded with the elves of a region, crafting wonders side by side. Their love for making stronger than the differences that set them apart. In those golden days, the gates of Khazad-dûm stood open, welcoming all who came in friendship. But nothing lasts forever. The world beyond their mountain shifted. Shadows lengthened in the east, creeping ever closer, unseen but felt. In a region, the elves forged rings of power, seeking to preserve what they held dear. But in their crafting, they caught the eye of one who lurked beyond their sight. Sauron, the deceiver, the servant of an older darkness, came among them in a fair form, whispering knowledge, offering gifts. And in secret, he wrought a ring of his own, a ring to rule them all. When at last the truth was revealed, it was too late. War came to Middle-earth, and the fires of battle swept across the lands. The elves of a region fell, their halls sundered, their rings scattered. And though the dwarves of Khazad-dûm did not march to war, they did not stand idle. When the black banners of the enemy came, when the wind carried the scent of ruin, they shut their gates and would not open them again. To the elves, it became a place of silence, a kingdom hidden in shadow. They called it Moria, the Black Pit. But within its halls, the dwarves endured as they always had. They mined, they worked, they sang their deep songs beneath vaulted ceilings. And always, they delved further, drawn ever onward by the lure of mithril, the silver light buried beneath stone. Their picks struck deeper, their tunnels stretched longer, their lanterns flickered against the dark, until one day, in the lowest deeps of Khazad-dûm, beneath the roots of the mountain itself, they found something else, something that should never have been disturbed. A tremor ran through the halls, a whisper in the stone. The dwarves did not yet know it, but Khazad-dûm had begun its fall. Beneath the great halls of Khazad-dûm, where the veins of mithril glowed like silver rivers in the rock, the dwarves twirled as they always had. The clang of pickaxes, the rhythm of hammers upon stone, the steady murmur of voices, these were the sounds of life in the depths. They had long ceased to fear the darkness to them. It was neither void nor enemy, but a companion, an old friend. They shaped the world in shadow, carving beauty where no sunlight reached, trusting in the strength of the mountain to shelter them. But there were places where even the bravest did not tread, places where the air grew thin, where the weight of the rock pressed heavier, where the silence was not empty, but waiting. And on that day, in one such place, the silence changed. Borir, son of Thalorn, stood at the edge of a newly struck tunnel, his breath slow, measured. He was a seasoned miner, his beard streaked with gray, his hands calloused from years of wielding tools. He had felt the pulse of the mountain beneath his fingers, had read the whispers in the stone, had trusted in its steady, patient heart. But now, something was different. The rock beneath his boots felt thinner, stretched, as if something below it was not solid, but hollow. As if something had been waiting. He turned to the others, dwarves standing in the half-light of flickering lanterns, their eyes wary, their hands still gripping their chisels. "Hold your tools," he said, his voice low but firm. "There's something here." A murmur passed through the group. Among them stood Nar, son of Fundin, an elder whose wisdom was etched in the deep lines of his face. His brow furrowed as he stepped forward, peering at Borir through the haze of unsettled dust. "You have the look of a dwarf who's seen a ghost," he muttered. "But I see only rock." Borir did not answer immediately. He knelt, pressing his palm against the stone, feeling for the old voices that ran through its veins. The mountain had always spoken to him, in ways that even the elves with all their knowledge could not grasp. But now, the song of Khazad-dûm was wrong. It was not the deep, steady hum of ancient stone. It was a whisper curling upward from below. A breath. "It isn't right," Borir murmured. "The air, it's moving when it shouldn't be." Nar exhaled, stepping closer, his heavy boots crunching softly against the loose rock. "You fear shadows beneath the stone." His voice was calm, steady. The dark has never harmed us, Borier. Borier lifted his gaze. His dark eyes glinted beneath his heavy brows. It isn't the dark I fear, Nar, he said quietly. He hesitated, then spoke the words that had settled like a weight upon his chest. It's what may be listening in the dark. A hush fell over the dwarves. The lanterns flickered, their flames bending, though no wind stirred. The silence stretched, thick, expectant. And then, from beyond the cracked rock where their picks had struck too deep, a sound emerged. Not a roar, not a rumble of shifting stone. A breath. It moved through the cavern like mist curling along a river at dawn, weaving between the dwarves, seeping into the heavy air. It was not the breath of something living, yet neither was it dead. It was ancient, too old to be either. And with that breath came something else, a presence, vast and unseen, pressing against the edges of their awareness. It had no form, no face, no voice, but it was there, watching, waiting. Nar was the first to step back, his skin paling beneath his thick beard. His hands, steady even in the battles of his youth, trembled faintly. And when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Durin's bane. The words rippled through the gathered dwarves like a stone cast into a still lake. Most did not know what it meant, not fully, not yet, but they knew enough. Enough to understand that they had touched something that should have remained untouched. Borier straightened slowly, his jaw tightening. His people had built their halls with courage, with patience, with love for their craft. But they had been warned time and again. The old stories, the whispers of caution from lore masters, the faint echoes of dread in their oldest songs. Delve not too deep. They had always thought it was a warning against greed. But greed was something they understood. This was something else. Borier turned to the others, his voice low but unyielding. We go no further. Nar's eyes met his, dark pools of thought, of old knowledge. Slowly, the elder dwarf nodded, but it was too late. The stone had already been broken. The silence had already stirred, and beneath the roots of the mountain, in the deepest dark, something had woken. The dwarves did not move. The stillness pressed upon them like the weight of the mountain itself, thick and suffocating. Borier's breath came slow and steady, but inside, his heart pounded with an unease he had never known. The lanterns burned weakly, their light barely pushing back the blackness that stretched beyond the broken stone. He did not know what lay on the other side, only that the air itself seemed to recoil from it, as if the mountain was holding its breath. Nar's hands curled into fists at his sides. Durin's bane, he had said, and the words had settled like dust in the silence. It was a name spoken only in whispers, a warning passed down through generations of dwarves who had long since forgotten why they feared it, only that they should. Borier swallowed, his throat dry as he turned to the others. We seal it, he said, voice firm. But even as he spoke, the words felt hollow. Could stone truly keep out something like this? Could they bury away a thing that had slept beneath them for longer than any dwarf had lived. Daryl, the youngest among them, shifted uneasily. "We don't even know what's beyond that wall," he murmured. "Perhaps it's nothing." His grip on his pickaxe tightened, but Borier saw the uncertainty in his stance, the way his shoulders tensed, as if expecting something to strike from the darkness at any moment. Borier met his gaze, steady and unyielding. "And if it is not nothing," he asked, "if we step forward instead of turning back, if we press further into the dark, what then?" Daryl had no answer. Nar exhaled heavily. "The mountain speaks, lad, and it is telling us to leave." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Borier turned back toward the shattered stone, running his fingers along its jagged edge. It was cold, too cold, as if whatever lay beyond did not belong to this world, as if it had been untouched by time itself. "We seal it," he repeated. And this time, there was no hesitation. The dwarves moved swiftly, gathering stone, piling it against the opening with practiced hands. The first strike of the hammer rang sharp and final, an act not of creation, but of burial. Rock and rubble filled the space where the pickaxes had struck too deep, closing the wound in the mountain. But the silence beyond did not retreat. It remained, waiting. The last stone was placed with deliberate force, every crack filled, every gap sealed. Dust still hung in the air, swirling in slow, hesitant patterns, reluctant to settle. The dwarves stood in the dim lantern light, their breath steady but shallow. No one spoke. No one moved. Borier ran his fingers along the rough surface of the sealed wall, feeling its weight, its finality. It should have felt like safety, like closure. But it did not. It felt thin, a barrier in name only. "We should leave," Nar murmured. His voice was low, almost reluctant, as if speaking too loudly might draw something's attention. He was not looking at the wall. He was looking at the darkness beyond their lantern light, where the shadows stretched a little too far, where the silence seemed too heavy. "This place is done," Borier nodded, though he did not turn away at once. His mind was tangled, filled with thoughts he dared not voice. The mountain had always spoken to him, had always felt alive beneath his feet. But for the first time, he felt as though it was no longer speaking. It was listening. Daryl shifted beside him, his usual confidence replaced by unease. "What do we tell the others?" he asked. "What do we say when they ask why we turned back?" Borier hesitated, his fingers tightening into a fist at his side. The truth was not something that could be spoken easily, not something that could be written into the ledgers or recorded in the archives of their people. "We tell them the tunnel was unstable," he said at last. The words felt strange on his tongue. The rock was too fractured, the walls too weak, that we made the choice to seal it for the safety of all. Nar turned his head slightly, his gaze sharp. He said nothing, but there was an understanding between them, unspoken but absolute. This was not a lie, not fully. There was danger here, though not the kind that could be measured with stone and steel. Darrell frowned, and if someone digs again, Borier met his gaze. His expression was unreadable. Then they will find nothing but stone. There was no further protest. The decision had been made. The tunnel was sealed. There was no reason to linger. One by one, the dwarves turned away, their lanterns casting long, shifting shadows against the walls as they moved back through the tunnels. Their footsteps echoed, swallowed by the vast emptiness around them. But as they walked, as the distance between them and the sealed chamber grew, Borier could not shake the feeling that the silence was following them. The halls of Khazad-dûm had always carried echoes, the steady ring of hammers upon stone, the deep voices of dwarves raised in song, the rhythmic footsteps of workers moving through the great corridors, the sounds of life, of labor, of a people who had made the mountain their home. But now, as they moved through the passages, it was as though the silence itself had taken form. It pressed against them like an unseen presence, winding through the tunnels like a whisper. Borier had always trusted the earth beneath his feet. It had been his anchor, his foundation, the one constant in a world ever-changing. But now, as he walked the familiar halls of his ancestors, he felt something he had never felt before. He felt lost. The deeper halls of Khazad-dûm stretched wide before them, vast and echoing, the great ribs of the mountain arching high above like the trunks of ancient trees. The golden light of their lanterns flickered upon the polished stone, glinting off the runes carved by hands long turned to dust. It should have been comforting, these familiar corridors, these halls where dwarves had walked for centuries. And yet, the feeling did not leave them. Borier could sense it in the weight of the air, in the way the shadows stretched along the walls, in the silence that felt too thick, too heavy. The mountain was vast, its halls endless, its foundations deeper than any map had ever recorded. And yet, for the first time in his life, Borier felt that the walls were closing in. Nar walked beside him, his steps heavy, his brow furrowed in deep thought. He had not spoken since they left the sealed tunnel, but Borier could feel his unease. The elder dwarf had spent years in these depths, had seen the rise and fall of minds, had read the stories etched into the stone itself. If even Nar was uncertain, then something was truly wrong. At last, Nar broke the silence. "I have seen many things in my time," he murmured, his voice low, careful. "I have walked tunnels that no living dwarf has set foot in for centuries. I have seen the remains of halls long abandoned, where dust lies thick upon the stone, and the air is heavy with the weight of forgotten voices." His gaze flickered to Borier. "But never have I felt this." Borier turned his head slightly. "What do you mean?" Nar exhaled slowly, the sound deep and measured, like a sigh drawn from the mountain itself. "It is not fear," he said after a moment, his voice quiet. "Not the kind that comes from battle, from knowing death is near. This is something older." He paused, glancing at the high vaulted ceiling above them, where the lantern light barely reached. It is as if the mountain itself has changed. Boriar did not answer immediately. His gaze flickered to the runes along the walls, the stories of kings and craftsmen, of victories and losses, of centuries carved into the rock. These halls had stood since the days of Durin the Deathless. They had seen the world outside change, had endured through war and peace alike. But Nar was right. Something had shifted. It has, Boriar murmured at last. He could feel it beneath his feet, in the bones of the world itself. Something is different. Nar looked at him then, and in his eyes was the same understanding, the same wordless knowledge that neither of them dared to voice. They did not belong here anymore. The feeling had followed them since they left the tunnel, winding through the corridors like an unseen whisper, lingering in the places just beyond the reach of their lanterns. It was not a sound, nor a shadow, nor a presence they could name. But it was there, woven into the very air, clinging to the stone like something that had always been waiting. Boriar clenched his jaw, forcing the thought away. They had sealed the tunnel. They had done what was necessary. That was the end of it. And yet, the unease did not lift. They reached the great forge halls, where the air grew warmer, where the scent of molten metal filled their lungs, where the sound of hammers striking anvils rang through the vast chamber in steady rhythm. Firelight flickered against the stone, casting long shadows, illuminating the faces of dwarves hard at work. It should have been reassuring. The forge had always been the heart of Khazad-dûm, a place of life, of purpose, of creation. Here, the dwarves shaped steel and gold, wrought weapons and armor, carved beauty from the bones of the earth. Here, the fires never dimmed. But even here, something was different. Boriar saw it in the way the younger smiths hesitated between strikes, in the way the older ones glanced toward the doorways, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness beyond. The flames burned bright, but the shadows at the edges of the chamber seemed darker than before, deeper, as if they had weight. Grendar, an elder smith whose hands had shaped blades for kings, stood at the far end of the forge, his thick arms folded across his chest. He had worked the forge for longer than Boriar had been alive, had seen the rise and fall of fortunes beneath the mountain, had known both triumph and sorrow in equal measure. And yet, as Boriar approached, he saw something in the smith's face that he had never seen before. Uncertainty. "You look like a dwarf who has seen a ghost," Grendar said, his voice low, steady. He did not turn his gaze from the fire, as if the flames held an answer he could not yet grasp. Boriar hesitated before answering. "Not a ghost," he said slowly, "but something just as restless." Grendar nodded, as if he already knew. He had been a smith for too many years to ignore the whispers of the mountain. "The mountain remembers," he murmured, almost to himself. "It remembers the hands that have shaped it, the footsteps that have walked its halls." He paused. "But it also remembers what came before." Boriar felt those words settle deep in his chest, though he did not answer. There was nothing to say. The forge burned on. The flames rose and fell, sending flickering light across the walls. The sound of hammers striking steel rang through the chamber, the rhythm steady, familiar. And yet, beneath it all, the silence remained. Somewhere deep beneath the mountain, something was still waiting. The forge burned, its heat pulsing against Boriar's skin, its golden glow painting the stone walls in shifting light. Hammers rang against anvils, shaping steel with the steady rhythm of labor. Yet the warmth did not reach him. The sound of the forge did not banish the silence that had followed them from the depths. It clung to him, heavy, like dust settling in the cracks of old stone. Grendel stood beside him, watching the flames with the careful gaze of a smith who had spent a lifetime reading fire and metal. "You carry something with you," he said at last. "Something from the tunnels." Boriar did not answer immediately. He did not know how to put the feeling into words. It was not fear, nor danger as he had known it before. It was older than that. Something unseen, something vast, something that had not belonged in the halls of Khazad-dûm for a long, long time. And yet now, it did. "We sealed it," he said finally. The words sounded hollow. Grendel let out a slow breath, folding his arms across his chest. "A thing that is buried is not always forgotten," he murmured. "The mountain remembers. And sometimes, what is buried remembers too." Boriar stiffened. The words settled uneasily in his chest. He had spent his life beneath the stone, carving halls, shaping tunnels, working the earth with his hands. He had trusted its silence, its weight, its patience. But this silence was different. Before he could speak, a deep tremor ran through the forge. The flames wavered, bending as if caught in a wind that did not exist. The sound of hammer strikes faltered, the rhythm breaking for just a heartbeat. The dwarves in the chamber stilled, their hands tightening around their tools, their gazes flickering toward the walls, toward the high arches where the light did not reach. Boriar felt the shift beneath his boots. A single, subtle motion, a stirring. Then it was gone. The forge remained. The fires still burned. The hammers struck steel once more. But the moment had stretched too long. The silence had lasted too deeply. And every dwarf in that chamber knew something had changed. Nar entered then, his heavy footfalls measured, his expression unreadable. He scanned the chamber before his eyes found Boriar. He did not need to speak. Boriar already knew. It had begun. They walked together through the great halls, their lanterns throwing long, uncertain shadows against the carved stone. Khazad-dûm had always been a place of echoes, the ring of steel, the murmur of voices, the distant rush of underground rivers. But now, even those echoes seemed subdued, swallowed by the weight of something unseen. "I spoke to the council," Nar said at last. Boriar glanced at him, and there will be no further digging in those tunnels. Nar's voice was firm, but there was something else beneath it. Not relief, not certainty, something heavier. The passage has been marked as unstable. It will be left alone. Boromir exhaled, but the tightness in his chest did not ease. Do they know why? Nar hesitated. No. Boromir nodded. It was better that way. Some things should not be named. They walked in silence for a time, their boots striking the polished stone, their breath steady but measured. The halls of Khazad-dûm stretched around them, vast and unyielding, pillars rising like the trunks of a great forest, runes etched deep into their roots. This place had stood for ages, enduring through war and peace alike. Yet for the first time, Boromir felt as though the mountain was holding its breath. Nar slowed, his gaze flickering toward the shadows at the far end of the hall. He was listening, not with his ears, but with something deeper, with the knowledge of a dwarf who had spent a lifetime beneath the stone, who understood its weight, its language, its silence. Boromir listened too. There was nothing, and yet there was something. It was not sound, not movement, but an absence, a space where something should have been, but wasn't. The air felt thin, stretched, as if it had been disturbed in ways unseen. Nar's fingers twitched at his side, flexing slightly. We should keep moving. Boromir did not argue. The great council chamber loomed ahead, its vast doors standing open, the golden light of the braziers casting a warm glow within. Here, decisions were made. Here, the weight of ages pressed down upon the shoulders of those who carried the burden of Khazad-dûm. But tonight, the chamber was quieter than it should have been. As they entered, the elders turned to them, their expressions unreadable. The air was thick with the scent of oil and stone, the heavy musk of dwarves who had spent long hours in deep thought. The runes carved into the walls shimmered in the firelight, whispering stories of kings long gone, of halls built to stand against time itself. Boromir and Nar took their places at the long stone table, their hands resting against the polished surface. No words were spoken at first, only the quiet crackle of the flames, the occasional shifting of armor, the unspoken weight of understanding. Finally, one of the elders spoke. "You feel it, don't you?" Boromir met his gaze. "Aye." The elder exhaled through his nose. "It is in the halls, in the air we breathe." His fingers traced the runes along the table's edge, the firelight dancing in his weary eyes. We were never meant to disturb what lay beneath. Nar's jaw tightened. Then why did we? The elder did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. Because we are dwarves, and we have never known when to stop. The words settled like dust. No one argued. Boromir's mind turned over the thought, the same thought that had followed him since they left the lower tunnels. Had they truly woken something? Or had it simply been waiting for them to listen? Another tremor rippled through the chamber, softer than before, but felt all the same. The flames in the braziers wavered. The silence pressed inward. Boromir clenched his fists beneath the table. The elders felt it too. He could see it in their eyes, in the way their shoulders tensed, in the way they did not name it. And then, from deep within the mountain, far below the halls of stone and steel and dwarven pride, something moved, a sound low and resonant, like a distant drumbeat, a slow pulse rolling through the stone. Not a quake, not the shifting of rock, something deliberate, something aware. Boryer's breath caught in his throat. The mountain was not holding its breath anymore. It was exhaling, and in that moment, every dwarf in the chamber knew. It was awake. The deep pulse in the stone faded, but the air remained heavy, charged with something unseen. No one in the council chamber spoke. No one dared. Boryer's fingers pressed against the cold surface of the table, feeling the weight of the mountain settle over him like an iron shroud. He had spent his life in these halls, had trusted in the rock beneath his feet, had built his home with his own hands. And now, for the first time, he felt as if Khazad-dûm no longer belonged to them. The brazier flames flickered again, casting long, shifting shadows against the carved walls. The runes etched into the stone shimmered in the dim firelight, their ancient words unreadable in the shifting glow. Boryer could hear the steady breathing of the elders around him, slow and controlled, though he knew every one of them felt it. The weight, the presence. Nar's voice was the first to break the silence, though it was barely more than a whisper. It knows we are here. The words sent a ripple through the chamber. Some dwarves exchanged uneasy glances. Others simply tightened their grips on their belts, as if the solid weight of steel and stone might be enough to anchor them. Boryer exhaled slowly, forcing himself to steady his thoughts. He could not afford doubt, not now. One of the elders, old Balin, son of Herek, sat forward, his gnarled hands gripping the table. "We cannot say what it is." His voice was low, wary. "But we know this, it does not belong to our world." He glanced toward Boryer and Nar. "What did you see in the tunnels?" Boryer hesitated. He had not seen anything. That was what made it worse. A shadow can be fought. A creature can be named. But this was something else. "We struck stone," Boryer said at last, his voice firm, steady. Beneath it, there was something hollow. Not a cave, not a chasm, something different. He met the elder's gaze. Something that had not been touched since the making of the world. Nar added, "We sealed it." Balin's lips pressed into a thin line. And yet, it did not stay sealed. Another silence stretched between them. Finally, another dwarf, Orek, one of the younger council members, scoffed. "It is nothing but an old mine collapsed by its own weight." He waved a hand as if dismissing the unseen presence that clung to the air. "We are miners, not children afraid of stories. The tunnels shift. The rock moves. What of it?" Boryer turned his head slowly toward Orek, his expression unreadable. "You felt it," he said quietly. Orek's jaw tightened. He did not deny it. Nar exhaled through his nose. "There are places beneath this mountain older than any hall we have carved, older than the first words spoken by Durin himself." His gaze flickered to the firelight, watching as it twisted unnaturally against the walls. We are not the first to walk these halls, and we are not alone. Orek's expression darkened, but he did not speak. The truth was written in the tension of his shoulders, in the way his fingers twitched at his side. He had felt it, just as they all had. Boromir sat back, exhaling a slow breath. "We do nothing," he said at last. The room turned to him, expectant. "We do nothing," he repeated. "No further digging. No further searching. Whatever lies beneath this mountain has been left undisturbed for ages beyond counting. Let it remain that way." A murmur ran through the chamber. Some nodded, others hesitated, but none objected. There was no need. The decision had already been made, not by them, but by the mountain itself. The meeting ended without ceremony. The elders left in small groups, their voices hushed, their expressions carefully guarded. Orek said nothing as he departed, though his steps were stiff, his hands curled into fists. Nar lingered at Boromir's side as they exited the chamber, their boots echoing through the stone corridors. "You believe they will listen?" Nar asked after a moment. Boromir did not answer right away. He thought of the mine, of the cold breath that had curled from the broken stone, of the feeling that had followed them ever since. He thought of the tremor, of the way the flames had flickered, of the pulse that had passed through the halls like the distant tolling of some vast and unseen bell. Finally he said, "I don't know." Nar grunted, "Neither do I." They walked in silence. The tunnels ahead stretched endlessly, the dim glow of the forges casting strange shadows against the stone. The halls of Khazad-dûm had always felt vast, grand, eternal. But now they felt small, enclosed, as if something beneath them had stirred just enough to remind them that they were not the first to carve halls in this mountain, and they would not be the last. Boromir's thoughts were heavy as he made his way to his chambers. He did not rest easily that night. He lay awake long after the forge fires dimmed, staring at the runes carved into the ceiling above him, listening to the slow, steady beat of the mountain's heart. But it was different now. Before, the mountain had been silent, steady, strong. A great, unshaken thing that endured beyond the lives of any who walked its halls. Now he could hear something else beneath it. A rhythm, a breath, a waiting, and though no sound reached his ears, though the stone remained still and unmoving, he knew the thing in the deep had not gone back to sleep. It was listening, and it was waiting. Boromir did not wake suddenly. There was no start, no gasp of breath, no moment of realization that pulled him from sleep. Instead, he simply became aware. Aware of the weight in the air, of the silence pressing against the walls, of the slow, steady pulse in the stone beneath him. His chambers were dark, save for the faint glow of a single lantern, its flame burning low and steady. The walls around him were carved smooth, etched with runes of strength and protection, marks meant to ward against collapse. against weakness in the stone. He had always found comfort in them. Now they felt hollow. Something had changed. He sat up slowly, his breath steady but measured. The halls of Khazad-dûm had always carried sound, even in the deepest hours of the night. The distant murmur of forges still burning, the low voices of late-working miners, the faint drip of water running through unseen caverns, all the living whispers of a city that never truly slept. But now there was nothing. No voices, no hammers, no breath of fire from the forges, just silence. Moria rose, his feet touching the cool stone floor. His boots were beside his bed, his belt with his tools laid neatly on the carved wooden stand. He moved with careful hands, strapping his gear to his waist, adjusting the weight of his hammer. He did not know why he did it, only that it felt necessary. The corridor beyond his chamber stretched long and dark, the lanterns casting feeble light against the polished walls. The runes carved along the arches flickered in the dim glow, their old words unreadable in the shifting shadows. Something about them seemed different. He stepped forward, his boots striking the floor with the quiet confidence of a dwarf who had walked these halls all his life. He had never feared the dark. He had carved beauty from it, had shaped it with his own hands, had made his home in its embrace. But this was not the darkness he had known. This was something deeper, something watching. He moved through the halls in silence, his hand resting against the hilt of his hammer. He did not know where he was going, only that his feet carried him forward, deeper into the heart of Khazad-dûm. The city should not have been so still. Even at night, the forges should have burned. The workers should have walked these paths. But the further he went, the more certain he became. He was alone, or at least, he should have been. His steps slowed as he neared the great forge hall. The massive doors loomed before him, their iron frames carved with depictions of Durin's first works, of the forging of mithril, of the shaping of stone into majesty. The flickering light of the braziers glowed from within, casting a dim, uncertain illumination into the corridor. Boryer's hand tightened on his hammer as he stepped forward. The forge was still burning, but no one was there. The anvil stood untouched, the hammers laid aside, the great bellows silent. The flames licked hungrily at the metal left, half forged upon the workbenches, waiting for hands that had abandoned them. Boryer's breath was slow, controlled, though his pulse thundered beneath his ribs. He stepped into the chamber, his eyes scanning the long shadows, the empty corners where dwarves should have stood. The air was thick with the scent of burning coal, of metal, of oil. But beneath it, all was something else. A coldness, a stillness, as if the very mountain was holding its breath. He turned sharply at a sound, a whisper of movement, faint, almost imperceptible. His grip tightened around his hammer, his stance shifting, braced. But there was nothing. Just the shadows, the the empty halls, the waiting silence. And then, a flicker, the flames in the forge wavered, bending not as if caught in a wind, but as if something unseen had passed through them. The shadows along the far wall stretched, curling, twisting. Boryer's breath caught in his throat. Not shadows, something else, something shifting in the dim glow. Something without form, yet vast, its presence pressing against the edges of the chamber, lingering just beyond sight. The runes along the forge's walls flickered, as if struggling to hold their meaning. The air felt stretched, thin, as though the very fabric of the mountain had been pulled too tight. And then, the sound came again. Not a voice, not words, but a breath, low, deep, ancient. Boryer took a step back. His instincts screamed at him to run, to leave, to find Nar, to wake the elders, to do asterisk something. But his body did not move. The weight in the air pressed heavier. The shadows stretched further. And then, in the silence, something shifted in the stone beneath his feet. A tremor, a pulse, not the movement of earth collapsing, not the settling of rock. Something asterisk deliberate. Boryer exhaled, his breath slow, steady. His fingers clenched tighter around his hammer. He had spent his life in these halls, had trusted the mountain, had shaped its depths with his own hands. But now he knew the mountain no longer belonged to them. Something else had woken, and it was listening. Boryer stood motionless, the weight of the unseen pressing upon him like the depths of the mountain itself. His breath was steady, but his mind raced. Every instinct told him to move, to run, to flee from this place, but his feet felt rooted to the stone. The forge's fire still burned, its flames licking at the metal left abandoned upon the anvils. But it was not the warm, steady glow he had known all his life. It flickered strangely, dimming in places where no shadow should have fallen, bending as if recoiling from something unseen. He tightened his grip on his hammer. The silence in the forge was no longer merely an absence of sound. It was thick, heavy, something alive in itself. And in that silence, he felt it. A presence, not a creature of flesh and bone, not a thing that could be fought with steel or strength. This was something else, a force older than the halls of Khazad-dûm, older than Durin himself, a thing that had slumbered beneath the weight of stone and time, waiting. And now it had stirred. The air felt thinner. The weight of the mountain above him, a comfort all his life, now felt oppressive, as if the stone itself was closing in. He took a slow step backward, his boots scraping lightly against the floor. The sound was deafening in the silence. Then, a deep vibration rolled through the forge. Not a tremor, not the shifting of rock, a pulse. Boryer's heart pounded. He had heard many sounds in the depths, the collapse of unstable tunnels, the groan of stone under pressure, the distant song of water flowing through unseen caverns. But this was none of those. This was something aware, The flames flickered wildly, stretching unnaturally as the pulse in the stone faded, as if the fire itself had been touched by something unseen. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the silence returned. Borier forced himself to move. Step by step, he backed toward the door. He did not turn his back to the forge, did not dare take his eyes off the flickering shadows that twisted in ways they should not. And then, from the corridor beyond, a voice called his name. Borier. He turned sharply, hammer raised. Nar stood at the entrance, lantern in hand, his eyes wide beneath his heavy brow. There was a tension in his stance, something Borier had never seen before, not fear, but something close. A deep, unspoken understanding that they had crossed a threshold they should not have. "What are you doing here?" Borier asked, voice low. Nar did not answer immediately. He stepped forward, his gaze flickering to the forge, to the strange way the flames swayed. His fingers flexed around the handle of his hammer. "You felt it," he said at last. Borier exhaled slowly. "I." Nar's jaw tightened. "Others have too." Borier frowned. "What do you mean?" Nar hesitated, then motioned for Borier to follow. Without a word, Borier fell into step beside him, leaving the forge behind. The silence followed them, curling through the corridors like mist, clinging to the roots of the mountain. They moved quickly through the great halls, past towering pillars shaped like the trunks of ancient trees, past walls lined with runes that glowed faintly in the lantern light. The echoes of their boots against the stone seemed subdued, swallowed by the same unseen presence that had haunted the forge. Finally, they reached the lower chambers, where a small group of dwarves had gathered. Their faces were hard, unreadable, but Borier could see it in their eyes, the same thing he had felt in the forge. The same weight pressing upon them, the same sense of something watching. Grender, the elder smith, was among them. His soot-streaked hands were clenched at his sides, his normally steady demeanor disturbed. "It's in the halls," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel it." Borier looked around at the gathered dwarves. These were not young miners, not smiths prone to fear. These were dwarves who had spent their lives in the depths of Khazad-dûm, who knew the weight of stone, who had trusted it all their lives. And now none of them trusted it. Nar turned to Borier. "The elders will not speak of it. They say the tunnels are unstable, that we've struck into something that should be left untouched." His voice lowered. "But this is not just stone shifting." Borier met his gaze. No. A silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then, from somewhere deep below, far beyond the halls they stood in, a sound drifted upward. Not the groan of settling rock, not the whisper of shifting tunnels. Something else, a deep, distant resonance, like a heartbeat. Borier's breath caught in his throat. The air in the chamber changed, thickened. Every dwarf in the room straightened, their hands instinctively going to their weapons. But there was nothing to fight, nothing they could see. The sound faded, but it had been real. It had been asterisk felt. Grendor exhaled slowly. We were never meant to find it. Borier clenched his fists. And yet we did. Another silence, stretching, waiting. Then Nar spoke the words none of them wanted to say. If it is waking, what do we do? No one had an answer. And in the depths of Khazad-dûm, beneath stone older than time, the silence listened. And it waited. The silence clung to the halls like mist in a forgotten valley, thick and unmoving. No dwarf spoke. No one dared to break the stillness that had settled upon them like an unseen hand pressing against their chests. Borier swallowed, his throat dry. The forge had felt empty, abandoned. But here, in the presence of his kin, the weight of the unknown pressed even heavier. A heartbeat. That was what it had sounded like. A deep, distant thrum, too slow, too vast to be anything born of this world. It had rolled through the stone itself, not an echo, not a tremor, but something aware. Grendor was the first to break the silence. This mountain has stood since the world was young. His voice was low, steady, but there was something else beneath it. Something Borier had never heard from the elder smith. We have built our halls in its bones. We have shaped it, carved it, made it our own. He exhaled, his fingers flexing at his sides. But now, I wonder if we were only guests here, and if we have stayed too long. No one answered. Borier's mind raced. He had spent his life trusting the rock beneath his feet, reading its stories, understanding its moods. He had always believed the stone held no secrets from him. But this was something else. This was not stone. This was not the deep places he had known all his life. This was something that had asterisk waited. Nar turned to him, his expression unreadable beneath his heavy brow. The elders will not speak of it. Borier nodded slowly. He had known this before Nar even said it. To speak of it was to make it real, to give it shape. And no one wanted to do that. Another dwarf, young Daryl, hesitated before stepping forward. His voice was quiet. If we sealed the tunnel, then why does it feel like it hasn't been sealed at all? Borier turned to him sharply. What do you mean? Daryl hesitated, glancing toward the others. I passed by the collapsed tunnel before coming here. His fingers twitched against the handle of his belt axe. The stones, we placed them there. I know we did. But the air coming from behind them, he swallowed. It's colder than it should be, like the breath of something behind the rock. The words sent a chill through Borier's spine. He had felt that breath in the tunnels before, curling upward from the deep, unseen places. But it had been faint then, uncertain. If it was still there, if it had asterisk grown asterisk. Nar exhaled through his nose, long and slow. It is not sealed. Borier clenched his fists. Not to us, but to whatever is behind it. He shook his head. It never was. Another silence settled, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was something heavier, a decision waiting to be made. Borier straightened. Then we do what we should have done from the start. His voice was steady now, solid as the stone beneath their feet. We collapse it fully, not with stones, but with fire. Several dwarves stirred, Grender's brow furrowed. Fire. Borier nodded. We set charges. We bring down the entire tunnel. We bury it beneath so much rock that not even the air can move through it. He met their gazes, one by one. If it is asterisk waking, then we must put it back to sleep. A deep murmur spread through the gathered dwarves. They were craftsmen, miners, smiths, not warriors. But they were also dwarves, and dwarves did not run. They did not leave their halls to be claimed by the unknown. Nar stepped forward. We will need black butter. Grender grunted. And enough force to bring the ceiling down. We will have to do it carefully. Too much, and we could weaken the halls around it. Borier nodded. Then we do it carefully. No more words were spoken. Each dwarf knew what needed to be done. They dispersed quickly, some to gather the charges, others to prepare the tools needed for the work. Borier and Nar moved together, their steps steady, their thoughts aligned. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only the silence following them through the halls. It did not take long to gather what they needed. Kegs of black powder were carried down through the corridors, carefully placed along the tunnel's collapsed entrance. The lanterns flickered in the heavy air, their light barely reaching the far edges of the chamber. Borier ran his hands along the stone one final time, feeling its weight, its patience. His heart pounded. He had spent his life listening to the mountain. He had never thought he would be the one to close its halls forever. We do this now, Nar said beside him. Before any of us have time to think twice, Borier took a slow breath. Then he gave the order. The first spark caught. A hiss of burning fuse. A heartbeat of silence. Then the world shook. A deep, rolling explosion ripped through the tunnel. The force of it sending dust and shards of rock cascading into the air. The mountain roared, stones splitting, crashing down with an earth-shaking finality. The dwarves stumbled back as the ceiling collapsed, wave after wave of rock pouring into the deep, swallowing the tunnel whole. Borier felt the force of it in his bones. The heat of the explosion, the rush of air, the sheer weight of what they had just done. When the dust finally settled, the tunnel was gone. Sealed, buried, the air was still, the silence deep. And then, from somewhere beyond the collapsed stone, a sound, faint, distant, a breath. Borier clenched his fists, and in the darkness beyond the ruin, something exhaled, waiting, listening, still awake. The dust had not yet settled, and still the silence pressed upon them. The tunnel was gone, buried beneath tons of rock, sealed by fire and steel. But the breath that had curled from the depths had not stopped. It had not faded. It lingered in the air, thin and unseen, whispering through the cracks where no air should have passed. Borier stood unmoving, his fingers still curled tightly around the handle of his hammer. He felt the weight of the mountain, but it was different now. It was not the reassuring, solid presence he had known all his life. It was uncertain. It was listening. Nar exhaled beside him, rubbing the dust from his beard. His gaze did not leave the ruined passage. "Tell me you felt that," he murmured. Boromir nodded once. The others had felt it too. The gathered dwarves stood silent, their hands resting on their weapons, though they knew no axe nor hammer could strike against what lay beyond that stone. Even Grendr, the eldest among them, said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the collapsed tunnel, his fingers twitching at his side, as if some part of him still expected the rock to stir. Daryl, the youngest, was the first to speak. His voice was quiet. It's still there. No one denied it. Boromir's jaw tightened. He wanted to say it was over, that they had sealed whatever lay beneath the halls of Khazad-dûm. But the breath had told him otherwise. It was waiting. He turned to Nar. "We say nothing." Nar's brow furrowed. "Nothing." Boromir's voice was firm. "Not to the council, not to the others. We write it as a collapsed tunnel, marked dangerous, forbidden for all time." He glanced at the other dwarves, his voice steady. "It ends here." Grendr nodded slowly, though his face remained unreadable. The others, one by one, gave their assent. No one wished to name what had happened. No one wished to acknowledge that something beneath them had stirred. The work of clearing the blast debris began, but they did not remove the fallen rock. Instead, they reinforced it. Pillars were braced against the edges of the collapsed tunnel. More stone was brought to seal every gap. They worked in silence, the only sound the steady rhythm of dwarven labor. But the air did not lift, even when they left, even when they returned to the halls above. The silence followed them. The great forge still burned, the city still stood, but something had changed. Boromir felt it in the way the halls no longer seemed as vast, in the way the pillars cast shadows that stretched just a little too far, in the way the echoes of hammers against anvils seemed softer than before, as if the stone itself was absorbing the sound, as if something beneath them was listening. The council did not question them. The tunnels had collapsed, and that was the end of it. The lore masters marked the area forbidden, the records inscribed with warnings that would outlast generations. No one would dig there again, but Boromir knew the truth. Sealed did not mean buried. Buried did not mean forgotten. And forgotten did not mean gone. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm continued as they always had. The forges burned, the hammers rang, the halls stretched wide and deep, and life carried on. But sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, when the halls grew still and the fires burned low, Boromir would awaken to a silence heavier than stone. He would lie in the darkness, staring at the runes carved above his bed, feeling the weight of the mountain press against him. And in those moments, when the world was quiet and the echoes had faded. He swore he could feel it. A presence, a breath, a waiting, and he knew Khazad-dûm had not forgotten what lay beneath, and neither had it